So, Alex Pereira is now a 2-division UFC champion. At UFC 295 this past weekend, Alex Pereira defeated former light heavyweight champion Jiri Prochazka via second-round TKO through elbows to the head. With this finish, Alex Pereira became the new light heavyweight champion and becomes only the 9th person in UFC history to earn a championship in 2 different weight classes. And what's more shocking is he did this in almost exactly 2 years since entering the UFC. Although you can say I had an incredible amount of foresight in predicting the outcome of this fight, given my first video was looking towards the potential next fight for Alex Pereira. To be completely transparent, I was not picking Alex Pereira to win this fight. I thought Jiri Prochazka's style and pressure was going to overwhelm Alex Pereira and he would eventually finish him against the fence. Even though some of that did happen in the fight and Jiri looked like he hurt Alex bad at one point, a lot of the exchanges looked very different than what I originally thought. In particular with Jiri Prochazka. I want to preface this by saying that this video will be more focused on Jiri Prochazka's performance in the later parts, but is in no way meant to discredit Alex Pereira. With that being said, in this video, we're going to go over the data of the 2 rounds that the UFC 295 main event lasted and try to dissect what actually happened. I'm going to start off by briefly going over the strike distributions from last video to give some background. From last video, you'll remember that Alex Pereira's significant strike distribution looked like this, with him having almost evenly distributed his strikes to each part of the body. Although he attempts most of his strikes to the head, he lands all of his strikes fairly evenly as seen from the pie chart. I mean, after all, Alex Pereira is a kickboxer, so you would assume he lands his strikes fairly evenly anyways. And as for Jiri Prochazka's strike distribution from last video, we can see that his striking objective is to primarily attack the head. He usually does this using his jab to set up his power hand combo. Since his stance is so heavy on the lead leg, he does not throw a lot of leg kicks and is very prone to receiving them. So with that overview out of the way, we'll jump over to the statistics of Jiri Prochazka and Alex Pereira's fight that happened at UFC 295. We'll start with Alex Pereira. Moving over to the significant strike distribution sunburst chart from this fight, we can see that Alex Pereira's significant strike distribution changed a little bit from the overall strike distribution before this fight. Pereira landed most of his strikes to the head and also landed a lot of leg kicks. However, this strike distribution chart is very deceiving. 12 of the head strikes that Alex Pereira landed were technically grounded head strikes when he was finishing Jiri with his elbows. If we remove those from the chart, then we see something more similar to his overall strike distribution, now with most of his strikes landing to the leg. And adding this to Alex's strike target landed proportion per fight chart, we see what Alex's game plan was all along. This still shows Alex's ability to vary his game plan depending on the opponent, like I mentioned in the last video. His strike defense in his fight with Jiri was slightly worse than the rest of his fights overall, but not too different. All these stats actually show that Alex Pereira came into this fight exactly as you would expect him to, with not too much variation besides his overall game plan going in. But when we move over to Jiri Prochazka's stats for this fight, we see something different than we expected him to be like, an anomaly if you will. So what do I mean by this? Looking at the strike distribution sunburst chart for his fight against Alex Pereira, we see that the majority of Jiri's strikes were to the head, which isn't too surprising. I said that Jiri mainly attacks to the head in the last video. But what's really shocking is that we see Jiri actually landed 5 out of the 6 leg kicks he threw against Alex. The shocking part here isn't the fact that he's throwing leg kicks accurately, but it's the fact that he's throwing leg kicks at all. If we look back at the strike distribution from last video, you'll remember that Jiri only threw 5 leg kicks total in 6 fights. Meaning that he threw more leg kicks in 2 rounds against Alex Pereira than he did in his last 6 fights between the UFC and Rizin. He hasn't thrown this many leg kicks in one fight since his first fight with King Mo. I'll talk a bit about this fight later. So, why the sudden change? If you were paying really close attention in the fight, you'll notice Jiri's stance was actually pretty light on his lead leg. This allowed him to throw leg kicks to some extent in the early parts of the fight. However, this is different than all of his recent fights, where he put most of the weight on that lead leg. To offer up an explanation for this change, I think this was done in an attempt to avoid some of Alex's outside leg kicks, since he could step away from them quicker. The threat of the leg kicks also probably prompted Jiri to attempt multiple takedowns and control Alex for a whopping 2 minutes and 45 seconds on the ground in order to avoid taking them. Also, because of his light stance in this fight, he wasn't able to establish his range with his jab to power hand combo, which he wasn't throwing at all. This is actually seen if we put this data point and compare it to Jiri's strike proportion for the rest of his fights. You can see that in his fight against Alex, he was actually throwing less head strikes than he normally does. He landed only 60% of his head strikes relative to the other targets, when he usually tends to keep his landed head strikes above 75%. Looking at his strike defense, we see that Jiri's defense was actually pretty good throughout this fight. His leg kick and body shot defense was better than his average, and his head strike defense was only slightly worse than his overall head strike defense. And if we remove those 12 elbows he took after getting dropped, then we see that his head strike defense was actually a lot better than his average, going up almost 18 percentage points. Comparing this new head strike defense with the rest of his fights, this was on track to become Jiri's best defensive performance in his UFC career. And this is even if you remove all the grounded head strikes from the Glover Teixeira fight. So, was Jiri Prochazka off in his fight against Alex Pereira? Based on these statistics, he was actually having a pretty good performance against him. He even hurt him really bad in the second round as he backed him up against the fence. And even though he came into this fight different than how I predicted him to, he was mostly making it work. It reminded me a little bit of his first fight with King Mo. I won't go too deep into the stats behind this fight, but if you go and watch it, you'll notice Jiri's stance was very similar to how he came out against Alex Pereira. He was a lot lighter on his lead leg and he was throwing a lot of leg kicks. Similarly, Jiri was also not throwing that jab to power hand combo like he had been in his most recent fights. And in both fights, for the most part, you can say that Jiri was winning as he was outstriking his opponents on the feet. That is, until getting a little overzealous and getting caught, then finished. This isn't to take away anything from Alex Pereira. I think Alex Pereira's game plan going into this fight was solid. He knew he needed to keep his distance to attack the legs early. And in the same breath as I can say that Jiri Prochazka looked different in this fight, you can also make the argument that Alex Pereira made Jiri Prochazka look different because of the threat of the leg kicks. Not only that, but Alex Pereira showed that he still has that touch of death power even after moving up in weight class. Even though I personally think Jiri Prochazka just got caught, you cannot deny Alex Pereira from the UFC light heavyweight belt, and he does deserve it. Alex Pereira executed his game plan perfectly and finished Jiri Prochazka, although not in the way that I thought. Not only did Alex avenge Glover's first title defense loss, but now he has the opportunity to do it against the person who retired him too. If you'd like to get my opinions on that fight, then there should be a link to my first video in the description or something should pop up now. Additional data, including some from Jiri's first fight with King Mo, will be available in the community post. If you like the content, consider subscribing, liking and sharing the video, and leaving a comment down below for discussion or video suggestions. And a reminder to please be respectful in the comment section. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.